Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning, good something. We are here at the Zoom version of our event, which was planned as a big public discussion. Unfortunately, the well-known circumstances did prevent us from being very public, but we hope that it will not harm the quality of our conversation today. My name is Fyodor Lukyanov. I'm chairman of Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. And I'm very happy that we were able to be co-organizers of this session, co-organizers with the European University in St. Petersburg, which took initiative to a big international conference, Memory of the Second World War, Glorification, Condemnation, Accusation, Justification, Explanation. And this conference will take place tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. And that will be a much more academic discussions. And we start today with a more policy-oriented part of it, online session, which we titled International Relation and Memory of World War II Today. It's no secret and no surprise why we choose this issue, this topic. 2020 was a year which initially was meant, it was designed as a very important benchmark in the discussion about Second World War, 75th anniversary of the end of this war. Unfortunately, everything was overshadowed by the pandemic. And at the end of the day, we have this process of glorification and remembrance of Second World War coinciding with another very big international event of different nature, but still a very powerful one. To a certain extent, that fueled our discussion even more, because the feeling of something big happening is very good, is very well connected to the era which we were initially intended to discuss. So I'm sure that we will have a very interesting conversation today. I hope that we have a big audience. I don't see yet the number, but certainly it will be emphasized by many. So to start, I would ask my friend and colleague, Professor Alexey Miller from European University in St. Petersburg, to give us a short framework in which the whole field of historical memory and history politics is being discussed this year.
Thank you, Fyodor. Well, if we look at the narratives of the Second World War, which existed for decades side by side, we can see that there are many and they're conflicting. There was certain difference in these narratives. Some of them were, so to say, officially approved. Some of them were rather marginalized. If we take European Union of the late 20th century, the narrative was focused on Holocaust as the crime of the crimes. And if we take Soviet and later Russian narrative of the Second World War in this time, it was about a military effort. It was about sacrifice, heroism, and victory. And these two narratives basically were in agreement with this Nuremberg narrative about the common effort of people of goodwill to stop the Nazi aggression and to stop Holocaust and to bring peace to the world. There were, of course, other narratives, for example, narrative which was and still is focused on the beginning of the Second World War. And here, of course, there was much less agreement because some would prefer to focus on August 23, 1939, as the event which just triggered the war and which made Germany and the Soviet Union together the main responsible parties for the beginning of the war, or rather the only responsible parties in the beginning of the war. And finally, there is another narrative which focuses on what happened after the Second World War. This is the narrative which also, like the previous one, speaks about totalitarianism. If the first one is about the tale of two totalitarianisms, here we have this story of how Eastern Europe suffered under communist totalitarianism, and that was basically the focus on already what we call Cold War. Interesting thing is that during the last year, this previously not so much stressed on, so to say, international level narratives got their, how to put it, official sanction, if you wish. If we look at the resolution of the European Parliament from September 2019, which was about the significance of the remembrance for the European future, it definitely supports this narrative focused on August 23 as the day without which the Second World War would not start. And if we take the declaration which the State Secretary, Mike Pompeo, signed and published together with 9 ministers of foreign affairs of former communist countries who are now members of NATO, and it was published on May 7th. It mentions the Second World War only in the first 3 or 4 lines. And then all the story is about the suffering of peoples of the Eastern Europe under the communist yoke. So what is going on? Is it that past memory, politics of memory, become more significant in international relations? Or maybe international relations are in a condition in which they also influence being extremely tense and conflicting the politics of memory on international stage and in particular countries. That is the question which is maybe the main one behind our discussion today. And of course, the question is how we can use this memory of the Second World War and the legacy of the Second World War in international relations? Is it only possible for bad or for conflict, or maybe there is also still some potential for good? That is what I wanted to say as an introduction. Fyodor, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really the framework which gives us a broad range of options to be discussed. And I would love to start. We have a brilliant panel from all possible places in the world. I would love to start with Professor Zelikov from Virginia University for one simple reason. Professor would need to leave us earlier because he has classes in his university. So we will use this opportunity to exploit you a little bit. Thank you very much for your agreement to join us. And I would love to start with what Alexey has mentioned. United States was not totally absent from the whole discussion this year, although the famous tweet by President Trump was not mentioning Russia, but that happens. Much more important for us is that President Putin, who engaged very actively in the discussion about Second World War, roots and consequences of this historical event, he wrote a very extensive article about that. And the most interesting to many observers here was that he preferred to publish this article, first of all, in the United States, in English, in the National Interest Journal. That was next day published in Russian, of course, as well. But the choice of first place for publication was quite interesting and generated certain discussion here, because not everybody believed that was an appropriate place. But anyway, for the president, it was important to address this issue, especially for the US public. So Professor Zelikov wrote a brilliant piece in the American Interest responding to President Putin's article. So I would love to ask you, was it something which attracted attention in the United States, and more general, is this part of political discussion today? I mean, not Putin's article only, but this issue.
So 2 comments on that line. First, that there was actually very little attention to this in the United States. Mostly Americans did not notice that President Putin had given these 2 landmark addresses on this subject. The first in his at the CIS summit in St. Petersburg, and then in this follow-on article, which he had promised. This is a simply extraordinary intervention by a major head of state on a historical question. And I must tell you that mostly here in the United States, it went unnoticed, as we are entirely preoccupied with other things, mostly internally. And of course, in the case of the president, our president knows about as much about history as you could fit inside a very small vodka cup. So first thing, mostly not noticed in the United States, mostly a controversy actually in which Europeans are arguing with each other, an argument that Americans barely notice or understand. Second interesting comment is this argument mostly has nothing to do with the origins of the war in Asia and the Pacific, which the war actually had already begun in 1937 in China on a large scale. The Soviet Union actually had already been involved in military operations against Japan in 38 and 39. This is a story about which, again, is mostly absent from the discussion. So on my part, though, I thought that this was a mistake, that Americans actually should pay a lot of attention to this. I thought that what President Putin had done was very significant and was entitled to receive a very attentive and respectful reply, because it was really important. In fact, there was a debate here with a couple of my colleagues, is like, which of us should write the reply to President Putin? So I had an argument with Neil Ferguson and with Stephen Kotkin. And finally, Kotkin and I bounced it back and forth, and Kotkin said, you do it. So but he knew what I was writing, and we talked about the scholarship, because I wanted to make 3 arguments, and the third argument has a lot of contemporary resonance. First argument: the whole thing was prompted in large part by the European Parliament's resolutions, which blame Russia for World War II. As Alexey just put it a minute ago, focusing on August 23rd, he puts it in a very polite way. I think President Putin's reaction probably was unprintable privately, but he then was very strongly motivated to make these unusual interventions. So the European Parliament wants to make the Soviet Union a co-author of World War II, and indirectly is clearly trying to get at Russia as a co-author of World War II, along with the Nazis. And so the first thing I wanted to do in this essay, as an American who's separate from these disputes, is to say that's wrong. That position is historically wrong. And that, frankly, Europeans should know better. I understand perfectly well the politics of this, as does everyone in this conference, and the factions in the European Parliament that supported this resolution. But it's very important to be clear that the history here is wrong. I believe it's wrong because the argument turns on whether or not Hitler would have attacked Poland if he hadn't made the deal with Stalin. I think the weight of the evidence is very strongly in favor of the proposition that Hitler was determined to attack Poland whether or not he had his deal with Stalin. And that actually those plans were very far advanced. And I go into some detail about this in the article, but fundamentally, I believe the attack on Poland would have occurred, war with Britain and France would have followed, whether or not there had been a deal with Stalin. And therefore, it's not right to ascribe to Stalin or the Soviet Union the role of a co-author of World War II. In fact, especially since the Soviet Union, to give them some credit, had opposed the Nazis in Spain, had opposed the Japanese in China in ways that the United States, Britain, and France had not. So first point, European Parliament wrong on the history. Second point, President Putin, in my view, went too far on the history on his side. President Putin mainly hinges his argument on Munich as the cause of the Second World War. The Munich conference is the cause. And he points out, with some truth, that the Poles had sided with Hitler's Germany in the carve-up of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and then even into the spring of 39. And that's basically true. There are deep reasons why the Polish government of Pilsudski and Beck were friendly to Hitler's Germany, which go back to the profound and deadly hatred between the Soviet Union and the new Polish government that arises out of the Russian Revolution and the Polish-Soviet War, which all the panelists understand. But then I say that President Putin goes too far because in a way he doesn't give the Poles enough credit, that the Poles had the choice of being Hitler's partner in a war against the Soviet Union, and they refused to play that role. Instead, they put their whole national future in jeopardy and marched to the chopping block rather than be Hitler's partner in a war against the Soviet Union. Yes, they would have been Hitler's vassal, but they refused to play that role and instead defied Hitler in the winter of 38-39, which led Hitler to then turn on them and decide to invade Poland. And he also doesn't give the British and French adequate credit for, after Munich, lining up to defend Poland, even though in many ways, had they wanted just to let Hitler attack the Soviet Union, the easier policy would have been to step back, let Hitler go into Poland, and let that be Stalin's problem. Instead, they decided, partly for reasons of their own, but for wide reasons, that it was time to try to stand up to Hitler. and that they deserve credit for that choice in the spring of 1939. Though there are a lot of things that one can say critically about the British government in particular, and to a lesser extent the French government, which I think is less culpable in this period. And there are also some negative things that can be said about Stalin's efforts to become a good partner of Hitler and become a fourth member of the Axis in the months after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 39 and in the negotiations on up into the fall of 1940. But I want to close with a third comment. First comment was that the European Parliament, in my view, was wrong. Second comment was that I think President Putin went too far in striking out at the Poles in his anger at the European Parliament's resolution, and went too far in condemning the British and French and not noticing the important decisions they did make. But the third comment is I wanted to notice that President Putin had a lesson for today. His lesson for today, which he makes, in my view, very clear, is that this war arose in part from a Versailles-style international system of insiders and outsiders. That because the Westerners did not want to cooperate with the Soviet Union then, they did not have a united front of collective security, and that was a cause of the war. He contrasts that favorably with the Allied front of great powers during the war itself. And it seems to me he's clearly making the point that an effort now in the 21st century, in the 2020s, to recreate a Versailles system of insiders and outsiders, with Russia, of course, being cast into the outer darkness as the evil outsider, that system is dangerous, and a superior system would be one in which the major powers try again to cooperate despite all their profound differences. It seems to me he's making that argument in the context of 2020. It's why he called for a summit of the UN Security Council permanent members this year in the spirit of the Second World War alliance. And I think we should hear that plea. And I think that that's a useful occasion for listening to that plea and thinking about the future of world order in the 2020s. And I believe the future of the world order in the 2020s would be better off if it were a more cooperative system and not a repeat of the Versailles system of insiders and outsiders that dooms us to a certainty of conflict.
Thank you very much for this very deep analysis, short but deep analysis of not just Putin's article, but the whole situation. If I may ask you one follow-up question, especially connected to what you said at the end of your intervention. Yes, we are aware that the United States this year was consumed by a lot of domestic issues, but sooner or later, something like a normal life will start to recover, hopefully. Can we expect that next administration, maybe another administration, next generation of US politicians maybe, will be more interested into analysis of that period, not just as history, but as a source for lessons for today, or maybe for the United States it will be less and less relevant, and as you said at the beginning, it will be seen rather as some European quarrel far away from us.
This particular administration that's coming in is much more knowledgeable about history and knowledgeable about Europe and attentive to the lessons of the Second World War. And at least some members of this incoming administration, senior ones, I know read my. So that in that respect, it's a very different group of people, just culturally and intellectually, than the people who populate the upper levels of the current administration. It's also an administration that does not want to simply leave the current situation in Europe on autopilot. And so it will try to reflect on historical cycles and whether or not there is an opportunity to break into a different period of history than the period of history we've just been living through, which in turn evokes the memories of the 1930s. Really, there is a fundamental question, and actually Antony Blinken has written about this. He expressly is, are the 2020s going to be like the 1930s? Which is the exact question President Putin raised in his article. And Blinken has raised the worry that it might be. That's a choice. One reason I wrote the essay I did is I think this is a momentous choice. And that in a way, President Putin is inviting us to think about this history as a way of thinking about whether the 2020s should be like the 1930s. And my hope is that the answer to that is no. So then that puts a burden on all of us to remember the history and then to use that memory in constructing policies going forward, not just on the Americans, but on the Europeans and on the Russians.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you very much, Philip. I would like to ask another prominent participant of our discussion, Ambassador and Senator Sergei Kislyak. You spent almost 10 years in the United States, being Russian ambassador there. But even before you had such a long and distinguished diplomatic career, you know America very well. When this article was published there, did you expect some kind of reaction based on your experience, some kind of reaction from the US? And how you can, from Russian perspective, explain what Professor Zelikov mentioned, that it was almost no reaction this time?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this interesting discussion with very interesting and prominent interlocutors. I'd like to say that I didn't expect too much of intellectually high-level reaction on political level to this article of my president. The reason being twofold. First, this administration in the United States isn't of the type that is investing a lot of thinking in the past as a source of lessons for the future. Secondly, as Mr. Zelikov rightly said, in my view, Americans do not know much about history. They do not much know about the World War II that happened not on Pacific, but rather in Europe, except for the sacrifice that Americans also contributed to the victory together with us. And that is the way Americans live. They are more focused on their own destiny within American borders, plus thinking about the leadership in the future. But I thought, and maybe it's going to happen bit by bit, that the article by Mr. Putin is not kind of a single shot event. It's an article that was very well thought of, that reflects my president's thinking about the lessons that need to be drawn from the past, from the World War II, from the lessons that we learned about ability to cooperate and being able to build a world where we can work together. By the way, as a result of the war, the world system as we know it so far was created, where there is a special responsibility of 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And Mr. Zelik was absolutely right, suggesting that one of the reasons why President Putin proposed to have a meeting of the 5 was exactly that, to sit and to think together as to what we want the world to be and to contribute together. And it is something that togetherness in this world is largely missing. And when I'm not a historian, I'm a practitioner, and I have been working on more simple and sometimes more cynical problems that arise in the real world of diplomacy. But I would say that we, at least I, see a lot of attempts to reinterpret the history of the World War II and the consequences of the war. And I do not accept that it's just a scholastic disagreements between historians in different countries that sometimes may affect decisions by a European Parliament. I see it more as a systematic, multi-facet operation of those who do not want to see the balance of influences, I would say, in the world to be fully restored. If you just try to look at what is being proposed as an alternative to reality about the history of the World War II, by and large, it has anti-Russian connotation. The responsibility for the beginning of the war, and Mr. Zelik has alluded to, in the resolution of the European Union Parliament, is absolutely distorted. And it's deliberately distorted, because the attempt was made to put Russia on the level of appreciation as its place in the world, almost equal to Hitler Germany, which is wrong politically, historically, morally. And that's deliberate. I do not believe in honest disagreement in this particular topic. You look at some attempts to reinterpret what was happening during World War II and afterwards in Baltics to justify the, if you will, resurrection of the support for those who, under Nuremberg process, have been found guilty of crimes against humanity, those who were collaborating with fascist Germany. SS divisions in Baltics, SS division in Ukraine. And it's not by coincidence that, say, in Ukraine, we see almost the prohibition of respectful remembrance of the joint victory in the World War II. And that's not by coincidence. It's all of these elements, in my eyes, fall in a bigger picture. And it's deplorable. It's deplorable because factually it's based on distorted facts. Secondly, it also reflects an attempt to demonize the Russian and demonize the role of Russia as successor of the Soviet Union in the current world. And that is something that troubles me a lot. A lot of misinformation has been spread around about the war. A lot of disinformation about the role of Russia. Sometimes just ignoring Russia as a contributor, a major contributor to the joint victory, like in celebrations in Washington. With all my respect to my American colleagues, I was taken aback when President Trump went to the memorial World War II heroes, and was speaking about the victory of US and UK in the World War II. I was trying to find at least a single word suggesting that Russia was on the same side in fighting Nazi Germany, and it nowhere to be found. And it's deliberate distortion, because even with the lack of interest in history with this administration, I doubt that they do not know that Russia has demolished 508 German divisions on its territory, that the sacrifice that we paid was absolutely enormous. It was simply ignored. Why? Because, and it's also deliberate. It's deliberate, and it's part of the current political environment that we need to recognize. And it's also part of, I would say, the overall concept, or rather strategy, of campaigning Russia. Now there is a new term that is being discussed in academic circles, at least in Washington, of constraining Russia. That is composed of several components: military deployment, economic pressure through sanctions, and enormous political propaganda campaign that is well financed, well coordinated. And I am afraid the more I read about the presentation of history of World War II in the West, the more I see elements of the same campaign transpiring in the discussions of the World War II. And it's deplorable. Sometimes I even heard that American leaders are talking in terms of suggesting that truth is more important than facts. And I was thinking about that notion, trying to understand what it means, how truth can be divorced from facts. But most probably, if you develop your own truth that you present to the rest of the world, it is more important than facts. And that is also part of the current picture. And that's also, as far as I'm concerned, applicable to what is happening when we are discussing the World War II and its impact on the development of the world in the future. And also, we need to recognize that after the World War II, we have created our predecessors, have created a world system that is based on, if you will, the need of diplomatic solutions to international institutions, even of the issues that have great importance and divisive between the great powers. But UN, the legal system that was created around the UN, is designed to do exactly that. Now, what we are hearing is that everybody, including Russia, need to adhere to a system that is based on the rules. Now I'm asking myself, what are the rules that everybody needs to adhere to? And these are not only the norms of international law. Those are rules that are introduced, imposed, and pushed by Western countries. And in this campaign of pressure and attempt to, quote unquote, containing Russia, unfortunately, World War II history has become one of the instruments of use by different countries in different ways. But in my view, wherever I see discussion of truth about World War II, about the role of Russia, it's not just academic disagreements, and it's very deplorable. I would add a personal note. My father graduated from a university on the 21st of June, 1941. On July 9, he was on the front, and he marched through the German, sacrificing the war. And for me, the memory of the victory and his contribution is sacrosanct. don't want to see things be so cynically distorted and polemic.
Thank you very much. I think it's always a discussion everywhere, be it in the United States, in Europe, or in Russia, whether certain developments are results of a well-coordinated smear or disinformation campaign, or in fact, sign of stupidity or ignorance. And sometimes I doubt what is worse, actually. Professor Zelikov, before you leave us for your class, maybe you say some final words, and then we go to other next speakers.
Actually, Fyodor, you expressed the hypothesis really well. It's basically, is this malignance or stupidity? In the which Ambassador Kislyak, and it's good to see you again, Mr. Ambassador, mentioned with this particular group and in the statements they made this year about the war, you really can't discount the stupidity hypothesis. There's a lot of evidence for the ignorance hypothesis. Because I mean, to completely leave them out is almost it's too incredible. You almost need the ignorance. The stupidity hypothesis is what seems necessary to rescue the explanation. But I'm open to evidence that there was actually a deliberate American design. But knowing what I do of the people, of the mediocrities who actually work in the White House and write these speeches and some of these statements, it's not at all impossible that the ignorance hypothesis is true. But it really is an occasion, though, to raise the questions that Ambassador Kislyak has raised. Is that this history is so important. This is such a formative narrative for every major country in the world, that the way people use this narrative is really fundamentally important about how it shapes their views of the present day. I would not, even though I'm an academic, I would not say this about all historical episodes, but the history of this episode really is that important. And I'm afraid there are signs that in every corner that this history is being now used for political purposes. And I think it's important for the politics of the 2020s for us to stop it and to try to get this back in a healthier place.
Thank you very much, Philip. And thank
you
you
very much. We wish you good students.
Thank you. I'll stick around for another 5 minutes to hear other speakers start, and then I'll have to drop off.
We do not keep you out by any means.
So we have two other very important guests and very good friends. First of all, Ambassador and Professor Tony Brenton, who used to be ambassador in Russia in 2000s, if I'm not mistaken, and Ambassador Ulrich Brandenburg from Germany, who was ambassador early this decade. Yes, if I'm not mistaken. So we moved to Europe, and I pass the word to Alexey to interrogate remaining speakers.
I would first invite Ambassador Brandenburg to speak. We are all familiar with the history of big and quite fruitful debates in Germany about the history of the Second World War, be it a historical strike in 1986, or be it a debate about Wehrmacht exhibition 10 years later in the second half of the 90s. And these debates were, so to say, born within Germany. It was not provoked by international context primarily, comparing these histories with current situation, it is striking that to the extent I can follow German developments, the debate inside Germany is not at all intensive now, while the issue is so prominent internationally. Why is it so? European Parliament resolution was adopted in September 2019, and if I'm not mistaken, the first voice from Germany came with certain important criticism of some points of this resolution. Almost half a year later, when your foreign minister Heiko Maas and Andreas Wirsching wrote this article where they questioned this point that the responsibility of beginning the war lies equally with Germany and the Soviet Union. But rather, the feeling is that Germany is rather passive in this debate. Is it really so? What do you make of the German views, German society reactions in this year of the anniversary of the 75th year anniversary of the end of the war? But I suggest that you first switch on your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Professor, for the invitation to this seminar, to this colloquium. I would have liked to come to St. Petersburg myself. You know that I spent all in all 8 years in Russia, 2 of which in Leningrad, as it was at the time, and I still have friends there, and I really would have liked to come. It's a place where you can sense history, where history is around the corner almost everywhere. And I remember one street corner on Nevsky Prospect, which says that in case of artillery fire, this side of the road is unsafe. I also remember the several times I've been to the Piskaryov cemetery. And later on, as an ambassador, I went to Mamayev Kurgan twice and to many other places, including to war cemeteries where Soviet and German soldiers are now buried side by side. So what I want to say is, as a German, and certainly as a German diplomat in Russia, you are confronted with World War II memories and with World War II history every day. And you will never forget the importance of this sad page in our common history for our relations. As to this particular, by the way, if I'm now living in Berlin, to be reminded of World War II history, I don't have to go very far. 2 kilometers from where I'm living is the Schönholz Memorial, where 13,000 Soviet soldiers are buried, victims of the Battle of Berlin. And there are more than 4,000 memorial sites for the Soviet soldiers who died in World War II in Germany. So memory is very alive, but in responding to your question, maybe there was a lack of reaction because this is not an open question from a German point of view. There aren't many countries in the world who so clearly lost the war. I remember when I grew up, I'm born 5.5 years after the end of World War II, people used to speak about the collapse, the Zusammenbruch. Germany was at point zero in 1945, and it's clear that World War II was probably the lowest point in our history, and the consequences are more or less clear. That's why you don't have anyone in Germany, apart maybe from the far right fringe, that would put any doubt to who was to blame. And sometimes I feel that it's if you resort to history, it is easier to justify discontinuity than continuity. And that's what how I understand the debate to which you alluded, which then led to the resolution of the European Parliament, to the response that you just discussed. What is it about? It seems to be about historical continuity, about having been on the right side of history, having been a victim, being part of the winners of World War II. This, for obvious reasons, is not it's not a theme in our domestic debate. You mentioned some of the instances when German historians were discussing different aspects, but the overall interpretation is clear, as are some of the consequences that we have drawn for our own international relations. And in terms of the Hitler-Stalin Pact or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it is certainly a historical monstrosity, but it would not lead anyone serious, I must say, in Germany to argue that there is how to say, an equivalence between the share of the guilt that the German side, the Nazi German side, and the Soviet side were bearing at this stage. There has been some discussion about this resolution and also about the reaction by the Russian president. Much of that concentrated on Poland and the Baltics, because they are obvious victims of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and Poland as well, because Poland was obviously the #1 victim of World War II. It was the first country that was attacked in 1939. So that's as much as I can say about this particular debate as it was perceived in Germany. In terms of the consequences for our international relations, they may not serve as a model because we are in a particular situation in Germany. You know that German armed forces east and west of the border were only recreated in 1955, 10 years after the end of the war. Rearmament was a very controversial issue. I remember that my father, who had been to World War II, was strictly against rearmament because of his World War II experience. And there is still a lot of reluctance in Germany as to military adventures abroad, as to spending on military. I know that very well because I was also NATO ambassador at some time. And we are sometimes being accused of being notorious pacifists as a result of the World War II experience. But again, this is an experience that cannot be transferred to other countries because there were very few so obvious of countries that so obviously lost the war, and in our case that are really to blame for its origins.
Thank you very much for this contribution. Yesterday we had a discussion with yet another group of people who could not make it to St. Petersburg for this conference, historians. And we were from Spain, Norway, Finland, and I have discovered that something which what here in Russia is seen as a particularly bitter experience between Russians and East Europeans when basically all the blame, all the bad comes from Russia and from communists, while nobody in Eastern Europe did anything bad, be it during the war or during the communist time, that basically the same several decades before happened in, so to say, old European countries, because all these narratives of how Blue Division or Italians or Norway Waffen-SS or Finnish troops were fighting on the Eastern Front. It was all about basically doing what they had to do while all the atrocities were performed by the Germans. Maybe we can learn from you how to live with it.
Well, how to live with it? I heard about the war. As I told you, I was born a couple of years later. I heard about the war from my parents, from my grandparents. So for me, when I grew up, this was not distant history. It was still, in a way, it was still alive. Today, it's, I think, the task for our media, for the schools, for the universities, for academia, to keep it alive. And by the way, all of these memorials, there are about 300 Holocaust memorials in Germany, or concentration camp memorials, 4,000, as I said, places where Soviet soldiers are commemorated. All that is part of an effort to keep the memory alive. And the first part of the answer to your question is, for us, it's important that we deal with our own history and draw the proper conclusions of our own history. We are not the ones to lecture the French or the Norwegians or whoever you mentioned, or the Spaniards, on their share of the blame. Yes, there was the Blue Division. My father, when he told me about his own war experience, he told me he also met them. But it is clear that the initiative, that the idea for this, again, monstrosity was originated, or came from Nazi Germany and came from Hitler and his surroundings. Others choose to either buy time, and this may be the reason behind some alliances that were concluded before World War II, to buy time, or even to take some fringe benefits from what happened, but it is clear that they are not at the origin. This is, again, among serious people, among serious historians and politicians, it's undisputed in Germany.
I must add here that actually quite a few weeks ago, Bundestag made a decision to add a very important new memorial in Berlin, because we have in Berlin the memorial to the victims of Holocaust, to Sinti, to victims of euthanasia, and now the Center for Documentation of the German War of Annihilation in the East is going to be built, and I think it is very important development.
There is already the museum in Karlshorst in the eastern part of Germany, which was the seat of the Soviet military command in the earlier years after the war. And that was the place where the surrender was signed on May 8th or May 9th, according to your calendar. And that's one of the places where, in particular, our war with the Soviet Union is being commemorated.
Okay, can we now turn to Sir Anthony Brenton, British ambassador to Russia for many years. How you see it from, so to say, European flank. I remember how Dominic Levin was explaining why Russia and Britain are similar in Europe, that they're basically two flank states which are trying to prevent Central European big states to dominate the continent. In these debates about the beginning of the war, among other things, how significant in British discussions, if there are any, is the story of 1938? What do you make of all these debates in Europe, seeing it from some distance now?
Thanks, Alexey. And I'd have to say it's a very unfamiliar experience for a British diplomat to be asked to offer a European perspective these days on anything, really. If I may, I'm going to start off a bit by, yes, what is peculiar about the UK in this debate. I'll then come on to the, because I think that there's a more general set of issues to be addressed here, which is the continuance of the memory of the Second World War on how we are all approaching international relations, not just about Russia, about other bigger views of how the world is. I'll then come to the wretched European Parliament resolution. And then finally, I'll come on to the question of the demonization of Russia and where that seems to be going. But starting off with the UK, as you say, Dominic Leven's identification of us, the resemblance between us and Russia, as flanks of Europe is rather shrewd, as so many of the things he says are. I'm British. I come from a country one of whose key historical memories is that we stood alone at the beginning of the Second World War. I mean, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not relevant to us. We guaranteed defense of Poland, which we couldn't deliver, actually, initially. We stood alone when all of our allies had collapsed. As I say, one of our proudest historical memories is of that 18 months, 2 years, when we alone in the world were constituted opposition to Nazi Germany. And that kind of dominates our memory of the war and actually dominates the lessons we drew from it. When I came to Russia for the first time as a British diplomat some 25 years ago, I actually knew very little, shamefully little, about Russia's involvement in the Second World War. I knew that we'd been allies and that we'd won, but it was quite a sharp lesson for me. In a sense, the other country with the proudest memory of the role it played in the Second World War is indeed Russia, formerly the Soviet Union. The huge sacrifices that Russia made in order to achieve the victory that we did eventually achieve was as ingrained in the Russian historical memory as our memory of standing alone at the beginning is in the British historical memory. Didn't Stalin say, the British gave time, the Americans gave money, and the Russians gave blood? That, it seems to me, characterizes rather exactly the various contributions that the three countries with unambiguous memories of having won the Second World War brought to the, I hesitate to call it the party, but there are similarities there. Now, emerging from the Second World War, as we enter the post-war period, I think we in the UK drew four, probably really quite practical, at least the impact of the memory of the war on how we wrote life, and four quite clear dimensions to it. Firstly, we saw the war not only as a military triumph, but as a moral triumph. Totalitarianism had been defeated. We rather forgot the fact of the sort of regime which had prevailed in the Soviet Union at the time we won. It was a moral triumph. It was a victory for democracy and all of that over the evil forces of totalitarianism. And we have carried forward the view that totalitarianism is a threat to world peace into our behavior in the post-war era. Not only us, of course, other people involved, notably the Americans, but others, and I think we're about to see a recrudescence of this feeling under the Biden administration in Washington with all sorts of consequences. But that has informed our approach to European issues and more broadly global issues. We've consistently backed movements toward democracy, opposed slippage by democracy, and been suspicious of countries that are not democratic and do not generally support human rights. And that's been a very important component of ours. And I don't cite the UK. I cite the UK because I think our experience in this respect is probably quite widely shared. Doubts about the contributions that non-democracies have to make to maintaining world peace. Second conclusion that we drew, and it comes back to the questions that were asked about 1938 Munich and all that, is that the word appeasement in the UK, I even went to the trouble of looking it up in Russian, has become a word of abuse. I say this with some feeling because I devote a lot of my time now in the UK to trying to explain to thinkers and politicians here that Russia is not there on the prowl again in the way that it was during the Cold War, doing things which we don't like and we hate, but actually Russia has reasons for what it's doing. And I find myself quite regularly being accused of being an appeaser. Now, this is a charge that I reject, but it sort of underlines the fact that what we did in Munich in 1938 is remembered as a national shame and a disaster. It didn't work, it didn't stop Nazi Germany, and it marked an abandonment by a country that at the time was a great power of its responsibility to try and stop things like Nazism. And that memory, and therefore the reaction we take to dictators like Saddam Hussein and so on, is informed by the feeling that we appeased then, the world suffered badly from it, and we cannot afford to appease again. So in particular, if you look at the Western reaction to the annexation of Crimea, what you're looking at is to some extent a reflection of that view. The third point I would make, which isn't so big, but is very current because this week is actually the 75th anniversary of the opening of the Nuremberg trials, is that you need more law in the way the world works. You can't just go out. I mean, there were thoughts at the time, of course, that we'd simply shoot the senior Germans who were left over after the collapse. We didn't do that. We organized the trials. The trials, actually, broadly speaking, were fair and justly conducted. And that for us was a lesson that you needed more law, more proper procedure in dealing with major breaches of international order. And I think we've seen that in lots of ways since the emergence of the former Yugoslavia Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, the use of international law in other areas. I think it's very much one of the conclusions which we continue to push as a result of the Second World War experience. The fourth point may feel slightly irrelevant, but it is in response to something Professor Brandenburg said. We famously have just left the European Union, and lots of people are saying, what on earth have you done? It's an insane thing. And the answer, I think, lies very much in the Second World War and its aftermath. We, alone in Europe, except for Russia on the other side, emerged, as I say, an unambiguous victor. Our orientation in the world wasn't towards Europe, it was outward. It was to the empire, which became the Commonwealth, towards the Anglosphere, the United States and other places. We joined Europe because we were doing very badly economically, and we thought, this is a place which will help us get out of it. And I worked a lot in Europe through my career. We were never comfortable. I used to go into meetings in Brussels where I was alone saying what seemed to me to be entirely reasonable British-type things to a bunch of people who wanted to, was ever greater union, was the phrase in the treaties. There was a feeling in Europe, a commitment in Europe, for their own reasons. Both losers in the Second World War never wanted it to happen again, saw European unification as a way of preventing that. We were never part of that feeling about Europe. And therefore, as Europe did indeed achieve ever closer unification, so Britain became less and less comfortable with it until the eventual, I would say, inevitable breakup a year ago. So 4 quite important ways in which the aftermath, the memory of the Second World War has played into current British politics. To come on to the argument, I have to say it's been a fascinating discussion so far, that has been conducted here, and the wretched European Parliament resolution, which I think Professor Zelikov said is bad history and bad politics, and that's right. In one sense, this is unsurprising. One reason why I'm rather pleased we're out of Europe, I voted to remain, but one reason why I'm rather pleased we're out of Europe is I used to deal a lot with the European Parliament. It is an army institution. It does really very strange things, particularly in in international affairs, because some group gets it gets the bit between its teeth to say odd things, do odd things. So can I say to my Russian friends, don't take the resolution itself too seriously. It does not reflect general feeling, certainly in the UK, and I think more broadly in Europe, about Russia's involvement in the war. And people who think about it and know about it, I'm sure that it's dismissed as a characteristic European Parliament absurdity. But the reason why that resolution got through, absurd as it is, reflects the current situation in Russia and the European Union, and more generally, the West. Relations are now appallingly bad. They're bad. I mean, both sides have made contributions to it. If we're talking history, then as I look back on various historical parallels, I think we in the West in the 1990s made mistakes of the same genre, although not so disastrous, as we made in Versailles. We humiliated and neglected our defeated opponent, and the result has been an embittered, angry Russia reacting in the ways that it has, and a steadily degenerating set of relations since. And I thought Professor Zelikow was fascinating on discussing the comparison between the 1930s, potential comparison, I hope, in the 1930s and the 2020s, because the danger of that embitterment, this is not just Russia, of course, we're also talking China, another country which the West has not given sufficient space and attention to. I can see a real danger of those relations slipping into something much more potentially problematic for all of us. And I would close, therefore, by saying that there are historical lessons to be learned there, including from the Second World War, and I very much hope that we manage to learn them.
Thank you very much. Actually, I wanted to ask all of you a question which is linked to what Ambassador Brenton was just saying at the end. The debate is deteriorating. The quality of debate is deteriorating. More and more we have this atmosphere in which basically the very possibility of dialogue is being killed. And if we look at many interventions in this debate made on all the sides, we can see such logic of confrontation, antagonistic confrontation, where this confrontation is not about confrontation of views, but rather confrontation which is supposed to destroy the enemy or silence the enemy or marginalize the enemy. And there is this feeling that maybe there is still a possibility to bring dialogue back, dialogue which allows for expressing, how to put it, complicated views. When we look, for example, at this article by Heiko Maas, it is clear that the intention is, how to put it, positive, to remind that, yes, we remember about our responsibility. But the point that we are alone to be blamed and we are alone who are responsible is obviously simplifying things. Can we come back to this complexity where we can discuss it? Do you see any possibility, or is it like our debate about the past becomes a hostage of our current state of international affairs? What do you think about it?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I'm equally concerned about the current state of our relations. You mentioned, or Professor Brenton just mentioned. But since we are discussing the role of history and the World War II memory in this context, I I'm not going to address the reasons for the current problems we have, but just look back on how different nations are dealing with how different perspectives can be regarding their role in World War II. From a German point of view, there is little room for ambiguity, and I made this point. And in that sense, there is maybe little debate about who to blame. In other cases, you mentioned some of the nations. There may be more ambiguities, and there may be more reasons to look into the details, to find out and to compare how other nations would see one's own role. And there is still a strong temptation to use history, to abuse or to misuse history for present-day political goals. And as I said earlier, sometimes it seems to me easier to resort to history to justify discontinuity rather than continuity. If you want to prove that you've always been right, and you refer to historical precedents, then you have to be very, very careful, and you should be aware how others see it, and you should be willing to compare. In our particular case, we have made good experiences with working with historians, working together with French historians in the very beginning, then with Polish, with Russian historians, to look into how we interpret the history of our countries in this particular period. And this is a painstaking work for historians, but it is also a way to avoid that history is being abused for political goals.
Сергей Иванович,
I hope I understood you correctly when you asked about possibility of debate. You meant possibility of dialogue, because debate is more academic, dialogue is more action-oriented. It's something that is closer to my specialty. And if I'm asked whether dialogue is possible, I said, of course it is. The question is, what type of dialogue? How honest dialogue our partners are willing to mount. So far, there's almost none of such, almost none. I think we were together with Mr. Vandenberg at the early stages in NATO-Russia relations. When he was at the Secretariat, I was the first Russian ambassador to present credentials to the Secretary General of NATO. And I remember the high hopes for the future that we would be willing and able to work on issues that divide us as partners. And we bumped into so many problems, but I remember vividly that my Western interlocutors were telling me, Sergei, remember, the NATO-Russia Council is important for good weather, but it's going to be even more important in bad weather. The bad weather came, we have significant disagreements, and NATO cut off all of the discussions and offsets. And I was asking myself, they are not able to talk, they are afraid to talk, and most probably they are not able to agree on what to talk with Russia, because NATO is pulled apart by different views of relations with NATO. Whatever the reasons, the net result is the absence of dialogue on the most important thing now, security. Security in Europe. NATO is deploying forces next to our border. Everybody's concerned about the heightened risk of miscalculations mishaps in our relations, and our Western friends are simply unable even. And it's just one example. EU, we have no meaningful discussions. More, we do not have any discussions with a number of countries, and all of them are in countries in Europe. In some we do, even on parliament. But I would like to underline one important thing. At no point we shut the door for this. So if our friends in parliament are willing and interested in dialogue on equal basis, we will be available always because we are interested in returning to normal. We believe it was us who created this unfortunate situation in our relations, but we are willing to talk. But we also need to understand that we are living in a world that is changing very fast. We have new centers of influence. We have new technologies that are being introduced not only in our private lives, but in international communications and international economic ties, almost in everything. We have the world that is becoming more and more multipolar, whatever you call it. But it's a world that doesn't respond exactly to the previous model that was so cherished by our American friends and supported by a number of major European allies of the United States that was unipolar. The time of unipolar world is waning. And everybody understands it. And Americans also, important and serious Americans understand. The problem is that they cannot accept it. And not being able to accept it, they mount the campaign of Russia to pull us all, including the Europeans, back into the basket that they will be controlling people. It's not going to happen because we are different. Americans are different. Europeans are different. We have Chinese, Indians, Greek countries that are interested in being part of formulating the rules and the norms of the behavior in the new 21st century world. So we are very much interested in being able to sit together, all of us, and work on smaller issues and bigger issues that would reflect new reality in a respectful way, in a way that will be more inclusive than we have been able to achieve so far.
Can I?
Please.
Can I add something to that? Am I audible?
Yes, now we hear you.
Okay, can I say a couple of words?
Yeah.
Firstly, I mean, I broadly I agree with Sergei. We're in a world where unipolarity is disappearing, which is visible to everybody except the Americans. And I agree with him too that one of the lessons I've been trying to push here is that we need to be talking to each other at the very least. That's obviously right. And one of the things that's badly wrong here as elsewhere, but this is politicians. The first thing they do when things go wrong, stop talking. The wrong reaction. So yes, more dialogue and so on. Nevertheless, I think over the short term, the prospects, the situation already bad is going to get worse. The reason for that is that Biden has his own. He has said, and I think genuinely believes, he had to be educated during election campaign on the dangers of China, but he's already said that he sees Russia as the biggest threat. And whatever else he may have focused on in his campaign, he has been very clear that he wants to bring democracy and human rights front and center of international policy, which inevitably is going to bring more tensions with Russia. Those are the realities. That said, I would also argue that there is a faint gleam of hope. I would point to the faint gleam of hope in the fact that Russia has not interfered in the US presidential election, Slava Bogu, and meanwhile, Europe is behaving and the United States is behaving in a much more constrained way in reaction to what's going on in Belarus than we did in the case of Ukraine. Slava Bogu again. There's the gleam in the beginnings of an understanding that if you can avoid stepping on each other's most sensitive corners, then there may be a way back. And I very much hope that we can build on that in time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we touched upon so many very important issues. Ulrich, do you want to say or? Yeah.
Yes, just in reply to Sergei Kislyak, yes, I do remember very well the days of the Permanent Joint Council, as we called it, NATO-Russia, and I was part of the negotiating team when the NATO-Russia Founding Act was negotiated and agreed in 1997. This is one, I feel this is one of the missed opportunities of the 1990s to which Tony Brenton referred earlier. It's one of many missed opportunities. I was always skeptical to the extent that NATO is not an all-encompassing organization. NATO is covering a relatively narrow spectrum of political and military issues, but still on these issues there would have been a lot of room to cooperate. We have 1.5 positive experiences in NATO-Russia cooperation. The most positive I recall is post-Dayton, when Russian troops were together with NATO deployed in Bosnia, and were really working side by side to solve a problem. On a slightly different note, there was a similar cooperation in KFOR, at least in the beginning. And I always found that the full potential of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and there is the Rome Declaration afterwards, should have been reached mainly on the military side with military-to-military cooperation. Unfortunately, this has all been affected by the present political situation. I mean, with all due respect, the experience of the annexation of Crimea and the Russian interference in the eastern part of Ukraine have made things terribly difficult for everyone in Western Europe, including in my own country, to argue and to support good and forward-leaning, a good forward-leaning relationship with Russia. We are all suffering from that. You know about my own interest in your country, and been dealing with Russia almost all my professional life, and there are many others, and we are looking for ways where there is room for improvement, but there are clear political obstacles, and two of them I've just named.
Yeah, Sergei Ivanovich, please.
I will be short. I cannot miss an opportunity to respond about the annexation of Crimea, which we cannot accept, not just because I'm Russian diplomat in the past, but it wasn't an annexation, and it's something that our European friends simply do not want to apprehend, because they have started campaign of pressure on Russia on this big disagreement, and having invested so much of labeling, resolution, statesmanship, they politically do not have enough courage to look into the issue honestly and to understand what happened. And what happened was a coup in Kiev that people in Crimea were not willing to accept, because they chose to join Russia, and we embraced it. And that is something that will be explained to you if you decide to go to China and speak to people in the street who voted very resolutely to be part of Russia instead of being part of the Ukrainian regime that was pro-Nazi, anti-Russia, and criminal. That was their choice. At some point in time, the Europeans will have to look into the facts. And here it's also important that recognize that the facts are more important than the truth that is formulated and pushed with the propaganda and political instruments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So inevitably we'll arrive to discussion, which is unfortunately very usual nowadays, and we see even in our extremely sophisticated and advanced circle that how difficult it is to find a common ground. But listening to all of us, I came to another conclusion. Yes, of course, there are a lot of political reasons for what is happening inside this history / international relations paradigm. But at the same time, probably it's inevitable that in a new period, which we obviously are entering in, there is a maybe not post-global world, but the world after certain kind of globalization, and this model of globalization is over. So now everything is changing, not because of pandemic, of course, but pandemic just catalyzed the trends which started well before 2020. And in this world, all nations feel much less safe, and they feel need for to strengthen their own identities vis-a-vis this uncertain and very much changing world. And there is unfortunately or fortunately no other source for strengthening identity but history. So that's why I believe that the problems we're discussing, they will be with us for quite a while, not only and not just because political controversies, but because we are moving towards a completely new era. And I hope that this nation building, it's difficult to apply to countries like Russia or US or Britain, but anyway, this will be at least try to avoid collisions of those identities rebuilt. So, and I'm afraid it's this problem is much bigger actually than just the political agenda we discuss now. Alexey, I know there are two questions there, please.
Yes, gentlemen, we have two interesting questions. One comes from Jeff Huss, and he asks, where is Asia? Where is Asia in our debate? I must tell you that when we planned this panel in peaceful times, still, there was an idea that we should have somebody from China. And hopefully we sometime can organize it on a bigger scale.
And maybe you should have had somebody from Japan.
And then South Korea, of course. Now, the second question is the question from Daniel Mutalov. It is a huge one. And it refers to what Ambassador Branton was saying, that we very often still use analogies and comparisons to the experience of the build up to for the Second World War, or to certain events during the war, in discussing current political issues, be it comparing Nord Stream to Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or be it John Kerry's allusion to Syria in 2013, if I remember correctly, about it is 15, sorry, the Munich moment. He was talking about this situation. So the question is, maybe as a kind of a security issue, we should stop making these comparisons, because they are usually extremely counterproductive. We can stay with one, the comparison which Professor Zelikov made. Are 2020s going to be 1930s? And that's it. So would you address these two questions? Where is Asia? Please.
Ambassador Branton should start, because Britain was reigning over such a big part of Asia.
It was quite a long time ago, I should say. Or I've lost the connection. Am I audible?
No.
No.
I am now. I've frozen here.
Yes. Now you are back.
Okay. Okay. Very briefly, I mean, Asia is going to become even more central to us. I mean, we Europeans have been the cockpit of all history, but the world is changing really quite fast on that front. I think our central concern in this little group is Russian-Western relations. It seems to me that those relations are going to be seen more and more through the prism of China's emergence as the core challenger to the United States. And just to set out my personal position, again, I've been arguing quite a lot here in the UK. The key power, if it is achievable, I'm sorry, have I frozen again? No, am I still audible? Hello?
We hear you.
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah.
Can somebody? Yes, okay. It seems to me, and I'd be very interested in Sergei's comments on this, that Russia's increasing attachment to China in the coming confrontation is not an entirely comfortable place for them to be. And my worry is about Europe. My worry is about Europe once again finding itself split down the middle on the great global confrontation. And I'd be delighted to see Russia attracted back more in the European, or into the Eastern European orbit, which is, obviously where we're all going to sit. And I'd be fascinated to hear from Sergei how he sees it from the Russian perspective.
Can I?
Sure.
I would like to say, first of all, that Russia is a Euro-Pacific country. We are in India. And irrespective of what is happening in our relations with the Europeans, we have huge potential of developing relations with Asian countries. Just being there. And we are embarking on a long-term policy of expanding our interaction with the regional groupings, with individual countries there, because it serves our national interest. And the last important, our relations with Europeans, including economically, are becoming the more interesting relations with Asia are going to look to us. And that is long term. It will be developed. When it comes to China, I wouldn't buy all these concerns and arguments about Russia having the chance to become a kind of smaller partner with Ukraine. We are where we are, and we are what we are. We have our own national interests. We will be serving our interests. By and large, when it comes to international politics, our views on what is happening coincide with that of China. And we are natural partners on a number of important issues. And it gives us a lot of opportunities to work together as very advanced partners, very honest partners to each other. And the Chinese have proved so far to be reliable, normal neighbors, and I think very interesting economic partners for the current times and for the future. Of course, we might have differences, but it doesn't make us a smaller partner, a bigger partner. We are what we are. We are where we are. And I'm feeling very comfortable about the future of our relations with China and with the rest of the Asian countries. And our relations in this particular region do not carry the luggage or baggage, negative baggage of relations that we have been enjoying with UK, with the United States in the past. But wherever we go, we bump into the United States and Europe, because even if you go to the Pacific, you will find that we are the closest neighbor of the United States, Canada and Mexico. So even in Asia, we will be working maybe along the interest with the United States or in competition with the United States. But in Asia, we have interests, we have opportunities, we have unused opportunities and capabilities so far, and we will be developing them going
Forward.
Yeah, just a brief reply to the first question. Why haven't we devoted a lot of attention to Asia? We are in this discussion with 3 Russians participating, and this is a debate about the role of World War II in politics. For Russia, if I understood correctly, World War II is mostly about Europe, and it's mostly about the war that was waged on Russian territory in the western part of the country. And it's not about Asia. So I understand that we spent, since we had no participant from Asia neither, I understand that we spent a lot of time on discussing a relationship between our countries and the importance of World War II memories in this context. The second point that you mentioned, Professor Miller, was again about the risks of using historical parallels in the political debate. I think recalling or remembering one's own history and the history of others and the history with our neighbors can be very helpful to avoid mistakes, to avoid a repetition of history. One can learn from historical examples, sometimes also from positive examples. And it is helpful, at least this is our experience, if you put historians together and let them together. And we have this experience with Russia as well. Let them explore history. Let's seriously devote time to this painstaking analysis. Find out why the others are taking a different approach, or maybe taking a different approach. The result can be very interesting and can be very helpful. The danger is always if you're using historical parallels that don't fit, if you're using historical parallels to blame the others or to justify in one way or another today's policies that you are pursuing.
As historian, I'm absolutely delighted with what you
because of the importance I'm devoting to the historians in context. You know,
Wasn't it a German philosopher, Hegel, said the one thing we learn from history is that no one learns anything from history?
Well, there's also the saying that history doesn't repeat itself, or if it repeats itself, only as a farce. Now, again, I would caution against drawing parallels between the 2020s and the 1930s that goes into the same direction. But we are all well advised not to forget what happened, what, among others, happened between our countries, and what the proper consequences should be.
Well,
Okay.
we are, sorry, Fyodor.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I think we had extremely stimulating discussion, which did last longer than I expected, actually. And that shows that we have lots to discuss. And I made for myself two conclusions or two tasks for the future. Number one, we should continue. And yes, of course, I totally agree with what has been said just now about the role of historians, but we live in a real world where academia cannot be separated from life and politics and vice versa. So unfortunately. So I think that discussions like this one, where practitioners are mixed with commentators like me or historians like Alexey and Professor Zelikov, we need to continue. And I hope that next time we will be able to meet in person. Secondly, yes, I think the last question which we received was very important, and we cannot afford anymore to have a discussion among, so to say, white people. Sorry for this political incorrect notion. So we need to include our friends and colleagues from Asia, maybe not only from Asia, because as Ambassador Kislyak said, the current world is completely different. And this is, by the way, another reason why parallels will not work anyway. So we still operate mentally in the environment where the West at large, including Russia, was absolutely central to international life, which is not the case anymore. And that's a lesson for America, that's a lesson for Europe, and that's a lesson for Russia, of course. I'm extremely grateful to all our guests from Berlin, London, from Virginia, and from Moscow and St. Petersburg. We were happy to host all of you on behalf of European University in St. Petersburg and Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. My sincere gratitude to all, and I hope that we will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.